It's impossible. None of us are perfect. And so if we believe that they're perfect and that they do see around corners, and I know some leaders like to portray that they do, it does a disservice, and it causes people, when they see these mistakes, when they see these Mark Hoffman episodes, to naturally lose faith. And I wish that they would embrace their humanity a little bit more. Mark didn't just fool President Kimball. He fooled the FBI. He fooled the Library of Congress.
And welcome, Rick, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And, your channel and your podcast has been something that has really helped me doing my research, both for the channel I have now and for research I did a few years ago. And some people might not be very familiar on this side of the world about what you do. So could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Gospel Tangents?
So my name's Rick Bennett. I'm the host of Gospel Tangents podcast, YouTube channel, and I've been doing this for about 8 years or so. We're getting close to 9 now, and I've just really wanted to learn more about church history. I've tried to do it in a way, a lot of times people get concerned about only talking to church sources and can you trust this other stuff? And I've found that one of the things I like to do is I like to get all sides of the story. So I talk to BYU professors. I've even had a general authority on. I think I'm the only one. Elder Snow, he was the church historian. He was kind of on his way out the door because he was turning 70 and they go emeritus at 70, and he was just a few months away from that. But I also talk to people that, and I hate to use the word anti-Mormon, but that could be construed as anti-Mormon. So Dan Vogel, Sandra Tanner, Will Bagley, some people that are very critical of the church. I often find that the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. And, I still go to church. I'm still active and that sort of a thing. But I like to find out all sides of the story. And so, and I try to be on my podcast as neutral as possible. I'm not trying to be pro-Mormon or anti-Mormon. I'm just trying to find out what happened. And so that's kind of where I am and what my podcast is all about. And, I know it's not for everybody. Sometimes I get these super Orthodox Mormons that are like, should you be talking about this? And I'm like, yes, I should. And then I get these anti-Mormons and they're like, you should just leave the church. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to. And so, so I figure if I'm making both sides mad, I'm right where I want to be. Although it can be tough to be in the middle sometimes.
I get it. I completely get it. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked to someone who has a podcast that also tries to be neutral. And honestly, I get a different feeling from both channels, even though both do sort of the same. And I think that we can get a taste of what the difference is by going back, to the beginning. And Rick, tell us a bit about your upbringing in the church. Were you a member your whole life? Were you a convert? Were you descendant from pioneer families? I don't know. What was your experience with the church?
Yes. So, yeah, I grew up in the church. I was baptized in the church. My mom has pioneer ancestry, and my dad was a convert. And so I kind of always identified more with my dad. So in some ways, I'm a second-generation Mormon on my dad's side, but I'm a fifth or sixth generation Mormon on my mom's side. I don't have any polygamy ancestry. My mom's side was German and English, and there's no polygamy. I'm married into my wife's family, and she's got a lot of polygamy in hers. So that's been kind of interesting to research. But I've always identified a little bit more with my dad being a convert. My dad kind of grew up in a very, I guess you could say, kind of a broken home. His mom went into a mental institution when he was a young child, and so he really wasn't supervised by either parent very much, and um, he he definitely did some things he wasn't proud of. Uh, Spent some time in jail and that sort of thing. One of the funniest things is when he was 17, he forged his dad's signature to go into the U.S. Air Force, and he smoked and drank and did a lot of things that church members wouldn't do. But it was in the Air Force that he joined the LDS Church and really turned his life around 180 degrees, and so became a good church member. After he got out, he moved to Utah, met my mom, and so I've always identified a little bit more with my dad than my mom, even though, like, she has some German ancestors that joined in Germany and everything. And I've actually, it's been interesting to kind of learn that, I guess I am kind of a fifth or just sixth generation Mormons. Anyway, so that's kind of my background growing up. I did go serve a mission in South Carolina and Georgia here in the United States, and so that was a very important part of my growing up. And then typical, got married, have 3 kids, and that sort of a thing. So I guess the atypical part is I started a podcast.
Perfect. And since you have this traditional upbringing in the church and you serve a mission, you get married, uh, did you consider yourself at the time an Orthodox believing Mormon? And there are different terms now like nuance, progmo, and things like that. Did you ever consider yourself with one of those labels or just a member of the church?
I was growing up. I was raised pretty traditionally. Went to church every week. I mean, and I don't want to say my life was just like perfect. I mean, I had times where I struggled with my spirituality, but I was generally pretty orthodox. And probably wasn't until 2006 where I started to kind of really, I started graduate school. So I little educational background. So I graduated from college, took a 15-year break, and then went back and got a master's degree in statistics. And so, it's funny because when I got married, I was like, I'm not going to be one of those guys who has kids and goes to college and everything. I got married much later in life. I was in my 30s and thought I was going to be successful. I did a lot of computer programming work, or not programming, but computer networking. So I'm pretty good with technology. But then my wife was like, you've always wanted to teach. And so I've taught at several universities and colleges here in Utah. And but in order to get like a job at like a community college, you really needed a master's degree. And so I decided to go back to school. So I quit my job. I became poor, just like the stereotype was. I'm not going to be poor, and I was poor, and I had kids. And I went back to school, and but the thing about it was I had a lot of time to study because I wasn't working, and I really just jumped into Mormon history at that time, and became more of a, I guess you could say, more nuanced, more progressive, that sort of a thing around that time. So.
And nowadays it's very common to hear the term faith crisis, or that is always linked to learning more about church history. Did you ever go through that, or was it just a learning experience?
It's funny. I just had a conversation with my sister about this. She's really kind of going through a faith crisis right now, and in a lot of ways, it's very typical with your typical faith crises. And, while I did grow up in a pretty orthodox, pretty normal Mormon home, I did have times where I would question my faith, question how things were. I would pray and the answer didn't come that I was searching for. And so I was always a little hesitant to put all my eggs in the faith basket. And so I've always been a little bit like, I don't know if God doesn't always answer prayers the way you want. And because we talked about that. And so I've always been a little bit like, and I don't want to say faithless, because I had faith, but I wasn't willing to, there's that movie where Indiana Jones, and he takes the step off the cliff, and then there's like an optical illusion and there's a step there. And I was like, I would never do that. I would never have the kind of faith to step off into the abyss and think I was going to fall. I would just be too scared. And so in some ways, I guess that served me well in the fact that I didn't get crushed by an answer to prayer that didn't happen, because I was used to that. And so I've always been a little bit like, I don't know if God's really going to answer this the way I want him to. And so maybe that served me well. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And, I think that I can relate to that with myself. In my case, I did go through what's called maybe a traditional faith crisis. And, once you go through that, uh, I understand how you're not as maybe blindly faithful as you once were, or as if you'd like to be. But it is an interesting approach to faith. And, in my case, after that, I wanted to do something. It took years before I actually started this. But what inspired you to start Gospel Tangents?
I had started a blog probably back about 2006. Well, and maybe I should back up. 2006 was a kind of a very eventful year for me for a couple of reasons. It's a little noisy out there, so I got to shut the door there. But that was the year my brother died. He died in a car crash, and that was very jolting to my faith, and really caused me to question a lot. He had 4 children between the ages of about 2 and 7 in the car with him, and his wife was severely injured. He was killed instantly, even though he was wearing a seatbelt, and so that was one of those times where I was like, kind of questioning God. Why would you? I mean, he was driving the speed limit, had a seatbelt on. Those are the things that are supposed to save you, and he was killed instantly. And 2 of his kids were life flighted to a hospital in Salt Lake City, and his wife was as well, with extremely severe injuries. It was a terrible, terrible crash. And so, kind of as my own therapy, I started a blog, kind of an anonymous blog, where I could kind of let off steam and I could argue with people. You'll notice with my podcast, I really try not to argue with people, but at that time I wanted to argue. I wanted to argue theology. I wanted to be provocative. I wanted to do a lot of things. And I did that for about 10 years before I started Gospel Tangents. And I got all that arguing out of me. And now I'm like, I don't want to argue anymore. Like, I just want to learn. I think God is very expansive, and I'm not afraid. And maybe it was because of my brother's death that I became less afraid to explore theology but yet, I was firm in my own faith. Like, I'm not scared of any issue. And I just wanted to learn, the true history. So it was kind of a combination of my brother's death, starting a blog, and just getting more acquainted with theology and history. So,
I see. Thank you for sharing that. And, in this world, in the faithful religious community, it's very easy to pick a side and then pretend the other side of the argument is the enemy, and you need to debunk them and add some ad hominem to them and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
it is refreshing to see interviews, from people all across the spectrum. I remember that I found your channel uh, because I saw an interview with Brian Hales, and someone took a clip from that interview. And in that interview, I think that you were off screen, so I we could hear you, but I couldn't see you. So you asked Brian about uh, Emma's denial of polygamy before she died, and I remember.
I only had one camera back then, so that's why there was only one camera. It was on Brian the whole time. I got two now.
And I was watching the video, and the purpose was to criticize Brian. So at first, I thought that
Oh, this wasn't my video. It was somebody else who was criticizing Brian. Is that what you're saying?
yes, they used the
Yeah, yeah.
and they re-uploaded it. And at first, I thought it was you. So I thought, well, yeah, another anti, things like that.
No,
Um,
no.
but I was pretty close-minded back then, and then I got to learn more about you. I got to watch more of your interviews. I saw you with Steve Pinecker. He was on the channel too. He was very influenced by you too, and I wanted to ask you, uh, now in this world of trying to be neutral and listening to both sides. Using Steve as an example. He's an evangelical. He listens to all sides of the restoration, and when I watch him and I try to be that. I think that if you're a believer, it can be a little more difficult than if you're a complete outsider. So I wanted to ask you, as a believing member, uh, how have you been able to find the balance of not arguing with people and listening to both sides and having that neutral aspect of the podcast?
I've always, and I don't have a training in journalism or communications or anything. I'm a math guy, but I've always here in America. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was a very famous newsman named Walter Cronkite, and he was the most trusted man in America. Now we've got CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, and they're all of them seem very partisan. But back then, Walter was trusted, and so I I remember growing up watching him. I mean, he was just a newsman. He had nothing to do with religion, but I really liked his style. And I just thought, you know what, this is what I want to do. I want to be like Walter Cronkite for Mormonism. I want to be able to ask the tough questions. I'm not happy with the simple answers. When my brother died, people tried to give me simple answers, and that just didn't really sit well with me. And so I just wanna know what happened. Some of our history isn't good. Some of our history is awesome, and I want to discover all of it. And I do know in the church, it can be hard because they're like, only listen to authorized sources, and so in one sense it's very partisan. Only listen to us. Don't listen to anybody else. But that's just like Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or and I don't know what they are in Mexico, Telemundo or something, but I don't know if they're considered partisans or not. But I'm kind of giving you an American point of view, and so I just wanted to be like Walter Cronkite, ask the hard questions, and I'm not going to shy away from anything. Maybe the temple, because that can get you in some deep trouble. So, but yeah, pretty much anything else is fair game, and I want to discover it all. And it's not for everybody. And in fact, when I get super orthodox people or super anti people, I'm like, you know what? My channel's not for you. I'm not trying to make everybody happy. I'm not trying to go for tabloid. I'm not here to sensationalize anything. I just want to know what happened as a historian would, as a reporter would, and I just, I want to get to the truth that way, without the platitudes, without the antagonism. I just want to know what happened.
See, and when we delve into history and we learn about things, like cool things that happen and maybe not so cool things that happened, um, there can be this feeling of maybe of betrayal, and maybe if you learn something that you didn't know before, you can feel maybe cheated by the church. Why don't this make this information more public? Or you can even feel betrayed by the people in the story, maybe Joseph or Brigham, and you're like, am I supposed to believe that you guys are prophets and things like that? So some parts of history can be frustrating and can lead people to doubt. So I wanted to ask you your experience as you've been doing research and learning about history. Did you ever feel that way? Or how have you approached maybe the more controversial aspects of history?
I remember when I was first getting into Mormon history, we actually, here in America, the girls will often get together and have a book club. And these were a bunch of guys, and they were like, we're going to do our own Mormon history book club. And one of the books that we read was Rough Stone Rolling. And I remember, and one of the funniest things is some academics, like Rough Stone Rolling by Richard Bushman. It's a history of Joseph Smith. I don't know, maybe people don't know that, but it's one of the best biographies out there on Joseph Smith. And it's been sold at the church-owned Deseret Book. And so the church has kind of tried to promote it. But I remember reading that book and learning more about polygamy. And and Richard Bushman has been a patriarch in the church. He's been a stake president. He's been a very good church member, one of the best academic historians in America. Ignoring his Mormon history stuff, like he's just a fantastic historian. And I can remember learning about polygamy and just being sick to my stomach, because it wasn't what I had grown up. I do remember growing up and people were like, "Oh, you got to be careful about studying church history. You might lose your testimony." And perhaps I went in with the idea of, I want to learn this, and I don't want it to destroy my testimony. So maybe that's what, that was a little bit of a difference. And so I went in with that I'm going to learn this. I mean, I know some people do that and then they lose their testimony anyway. But I've read some Jewish rabbis and things like that about learning about the Bible or whatever, and there's a place for both faith and reason, or faith and science, and so we don't. If our world's so small that we have to choose one over the other, that's sad. I think God is bigger than everything, and we don't have to choose one or the other. Some of us can't live with that cognitive dissonance, and it's easier to just throw one way or the other. It's either just to become fully faithful or fully scientific. To me, wrestling with those apparent conflicts is where all the fun is. It's where all the interesting stuff is. And so I don't know. Not everybody's built this way. And my podcast is to look for people who enjoy the wrestle, enjoy wrestling with tough things. And if that's not you, if you just want to go read the Book of Mormon, the Bible, and read all those things, that's fine. You're not my audience. Or if you want to be critical and read all the critical things, behind me I've got Convicting the Mormons there. That's by a good church member, but that's not for everybody. That book behind me there is about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I don't know if you've covered that on your channel. It's the worst chapter in Mormon history, in which Mormons were responsible for killing about 100 Arkansas immigrants traveling through Utah in 1857. It's a terrible, terrible story, and it was used as a bludgeon to persecute Mormons. I mean, and Mormons are to blame. They tried to blame it on the Indians at the time, but we're responsible. And some people don't want to learn that. And some people use it as a bludgeon against the church. And I just want to be like, this is what happened. We should be sad that it happened. We're not the only church that's had terrible things. Islam has jihad, and Christianity has the Crusades. And, any church has a bad chapter, has a black eye about something. And it's part of life. And so I don't expect perfection from my church leaders. Some people do. And I think when you do, it sets you up for disillusionment, and you go from, I'm going to be fully faithful, to I'm going to be fully antagonistic. And it's sad. I think we just need to be bigger and to grow and to understand that, everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. One of the things I like to do on my podcast is when I'm doing an introduction and I flub it up or whatever, I will put that at the beginning, because I make mistakes. I try to laugh at it to make fun of myself. But yeah, I'm not perfect. And I hope my listeners, usually with these little funny, I slip up and I say something goofy or whatever. It lets my listeners know, hey, I'm not perfect. Some of them still think I am. They hold me up as a model. And I guess that's kind of nice, but it's kind of scary too, because I make mistakes. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to say mean things at times. I try not to on my podcast, but I'm giving you my best self on camera. I'm not off camera. Sometimes I'm a jerk. So the church does the same thing. We always try to put our best foot forward. We always try to do right things, but off camera, sometimes we do things that we're not proud of.
Now as we know a little bit more about what you do in Gospel Tangents, and what's your stance on the gospel, on history, on what the church does and things like that, I wanted to ask you a couple of things regarding maybe some stereotypes that we still believe. And I wanted to hear your take on that. And the first one is about critics of the church. And for example, here in Mexico, I can speak for all of Latin America, but at least here in Mexico, it's pretty common to see critics of the church as the worst people in the world, and bitter people, and people who just want to destroy faith. And a question that I've heard many people ask is, why don't you leave the church alone, right? And some people might say, why is people you mentioned, Sandra Tanner or Dan Vogel, why are they so obsessed with history? Why don't they just do something else? And I think that people often have the idea that maybe they are in a corner typing critical stuff, thinking that this is gonna destroy people's faith and things like that. So sometimes we have that stereotype. And I think that as personally, as I've been going through this journey and learning new things, I remember that once I saw a picture of Brian Hales and Dan Vogel at the Mormon History Association, uh, just smiling and taking a picture together. And what are your thoughts on this belief and with your experience with people? And I've seen that you've given talks in conferences, and there are people from all spectrums interested in history. So I think that's been pretty interesting. And I just wanted to hear your take based on your experiences with these people.
Well, first of all, Mormon history, everybody should like it because it's interesting. It's really interesting if you find out. I've interviewed a Baptist pastor twice by the name of Kyle Bashirs, and he loves Mormon history. Grew up Baptist, has been Baptist his whole life, but he's really a specialist in James Strang. I don't know if your listeners know who James Strang is. Should I share who he is?
Yes, just in case.
Okay. So James Strang, on the day that Joseph Smith died on June 28th, 1844? I think that's the right date. 1844 was the right year anyway. On that day, a man a recent convert by the name of James Strang claims that an angel came to him and ordained him to be the new prophet of the church. And so he was actually a fairly big rival of Brigham Young at the time. And he led a church called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's got the same name as our church. It's a capital D instead of a lowercase d. There's no dash in his church. But that church is still in existence today. And so my friend, Pastor Kyle Bashirs, is a James Strang expert and has written a ton on James Strang. And he's like, it's just so interesting. And I love Kyle because he's not antagonistic towards the church. He's just plain interested because it's so interesting. And we could go off on James Strang. He followed Joseph Smith a lot, translated plates, had revelations, moved his congregation from Wisconsin to Michigan. And anyway, there have been books written about it. It's like a soap opera almost, kind of like Joseph Smith, kind of a soap opera in a way. But so some of these other people, Sandra Tanner, I can't tell you, she was one of the nicest people I've ever met. Like truly a friendly person. Dan Vogel, we spoke for 4 hours on camera at his home in Ohio. And then after we turned the camera off, I sat in his kitchen and he fed me lunch and we talked for another 2 hours. Like, these people are just so amazingly friendly and nice. And they're so interested in Mormon history. And, and Sandra Tanner especially, well, both of them, Sandra and Dan, have definitely been known as critics. They don't believe in the church. One of the interesting things about Sandra and her husband, Gerald, they were big critics back in the 1960s. Gerald has since passed away. Sandra's still living here. But she has since joined a Protestant church. And she told she and Gerald told their pastor, if you say anything bad about the Mormons, we will leave. Because they still have family members that are Mormons. And so they just have a different perspective on theology, on the Book of Mormon, on Joseph Smith. But a lot of their research, I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's good research. It's really well done, well researched. Everybody has a perspective on things, and I don't necessarily agree with their perspective. The other reason that I interviewed Sandra, which I thought was really strange, was, it was actually, it was really weird. I was at a conference, and I was there with Matt Harris and Noel Bringhurst, and then this older woman walked up, and I had no clue who she was. And so Matt and Newell invited this woman to go to dinner with us, and as I'm sitting there, I'm like, is this Sandra Tanner? I think it is. And she was just a delightful person, really friendly. And so we're sitting there at dinner, and I said, Sandra, how did you know Mark Hoffman was forging documents? And she said, I didn't. It was all Gerald. She said, I thought it was legit. And for those, and I don't know how familiar your people are with Mark Hoffman, but Mark Hoffman was a forger back in the 1980s. He created some Mormon documents. There's a great video on Netflix called Murder Among the Mormons, although it's in English. I don't know if they have Spanish subtitles. Hopefully they do. But it talks about that time in the 1980s. Mark was creating these both good and bad documents that would make some of the documents would make the church look bad. And one of them was called the Salamander Letter. And supposedly it was written in the handwriting of Martin Harris, and it talked about when a white salamander came to Joseph Smith and then turned into an angel and then gave him the gold plates. And a lot of historians thought this was, even church historians thought this was a real document. And so Gerald and Sandra at the time in the 1980s were known as anti-Mormons, but Gerald was the first one. He says, this sounds way too much like the 1832 book Mormonism Unveiled, and I don't think it's legit. Now, he didn't think that Mark Hoffman had forged it. He thought it was a forgery from the 1800s. And Sandra was like, well, all the church historians are saying it's real. Gerald, like, we're going to get sued. He's like, we're not going to get sued. And she's like, don't lose my home, Gerald, which I just thought was the funniest thing. So in their own way, they are searching for the truth. They're not going to believe just any anti-Mormon lie. But they obviously don't believe the church is true, or the Book of Mormon's true. But it was that whole episode about Mark Hoffman. That was why I had her on, because, it's kind of like dog bites man story, or man bites dog, I guess I should say. It's just kind of strange that you'd have these anti-Mormons who are like, I think this is a forgery. And then it turned out they were right. And so, you don't have to agree with them, but you have to respect them for that stance and calling into question Mark Hoffman, which I thought was pretty amazing.
I see. And now that you share this, one thing came to mind, and maybe this is just opinion based, but I was thinking about maybe how the church maybe portrays this information and the people sharing that information. And, it really depends on the time period. And one can say that it's pretty common to have the idea that maybe church leaders have endorsed this idea that critics of the church are anti-bitter people bound to destroy faith, maybe deceived by Satan or things like that. And some people might say that maybe the stereotype that maybe doesn't allow us to be more open was implemented by the church itself. Do you believe that? Or how do you feel the church has handled outside information?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the first anti-Mormon book was written in 1832, a guy by the name of E.D. Howe and Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. Doctor was his name, it wasn't a title. And they were trying to destroy faith. I think, if I remember, well, both of them, both Dr. Philastus Hurlbut and E.D. Howe, had family members that had joined the church, And so they were trying to destroy faith. They were trying to dig up dirt. And so the church has taken this protective, defensive position. I mean, this was 1832 that book was written. So since the beginning of the church, basically, they've always had critics attacking them. And so I can understand why the church is so defensive about certain things. I think originally, we talk about how did Joseph Smith translate the plates. And so also behind me here, I have a Urim and Thummim right there. Here, let me grab it. This was a listener that made these, and these look kind of like glasses. You'll notice that they don't have side pieces. And when you put them up to your face, I don't know if you can see this. Whoa, dropped it. You can see that this is wider than my eyes. So if I were to use this, it doesn't work very well. And from what I understand, Richard Bushman says these were really hard to use, and how do you strap them to your head? And you can only see them through one eye at a time. But this is, probably what it looked like. The Urim and Thummim looked like. And so I'll just hold it, I guess. But so Joseph found it very difficult to use. It sounds like the first 116 pages he was using this to translate, and then he found a seer stone that he found easier to use. And so supposedly he would put it in a hat. I have a hat here. It wasn't a baseball cap, though. And sometimes he would put either the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone, and then he would look in the hat, and he would get the translation, and he would find that easier to do. And so when Dr. Hurlbut learned about this, that was one of the big things he wrote, because it sounds really weird. Oh, I'm going to put either a seer stone, and there's an argument about whether it was a seer stone or Urim and Thummim in the hat, and he would look in it and the words would appear, whatever. So from the earliest days, Dr. Hurlbut and E.D. Howe said, this sounds really stupid. It sounds, like a crystal ball. I mean, we would think of like a crystal ball or something. It sounds really strange. And so that's why the seer stone has been kind of de-emphasized since then. But we have people like Richard Bushman and others that have said, well, that's what happened. That's what the records say. And then we have other people that are like, no, it was the Urim and Thummim. And anyway, so it's kind of a big dispute. But to answer your question, and I know that was a really long answer, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. He used both. He used the seer stone. He used the Urim and Thummim. He used both. And I think we need to get over our discomfort about, wow, this looks kind of weird. I mean, how is that any different than Moses putting a serpent on a stick and saying, if you look at this stick, you'll be healed. That's kind of a weird story, and there's a lot of weird stories in the Bible. Why all the plagues and the pestilences and everything, there's a lot of really weird stuff in the Bible. If we truly believe in God, God does really strange things sometimes. And so we shouldn't be concerned. We shouldn't use our modern lens and, oh my gosh, that's weird. If that's what happened, it's what happened. I just want to know what happened. And you have people like Dr. Hurlbut, E.D. Howe, Sandra Tanner, Dan Vogel, that may try to make this sound weird. But if God can do anything, God can do it in a weird way or a conventional way. He's a miracle worker. So, that's kind of where I come down. And I can understand how that's hard to believe for a Sandra Tanner or even Dr. Hurlbut. It was hard for him to believe. He didn't like it. But if it's what happened, it's what happened. And I'm comfortable with, I guess, weird things happening. Miracles are weird by definition, right? They're unusual.
I get it. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, I think that the not so pretty part of history is that sometimes the information is not enough to reach a conclusion, and sometimes it is. And as you mentioned, if something happened, it just happened. And I think that once, if the answer is not very clear, then you can feel pretty insecure. I felt that myself, and I think that's something we all need to deal with in a way.
Right.
And moving on to the last couple of questions that I have is first, it'll be about another stereotype. And this is something that is not as common as the anti-stereotype, but it's still out there. And it's about the different branches of the church. We talked about Gene Strang a few minutes ago. And the stereotype is that these people are insane, and obviously everything they say is false, and the reason why they're not as big as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with lowercase d, it means that that shows that they're a failure. So maybe that narrative, it's a bit more antagonistic. And for example, when I served a mission in Tijuana, Mexico, I I honestly don't know if it was Community of Christ or someone else, but they encouraged some missionaries and they said, "Oh, you're Brighamites and you guys are wrong," and things like that.
Oh, wow.
And so, what have you learned about the different branches during your podcast?
So that is one of my favorite topics, is to talk about different branches of the restoration. And in fact, right here is Bill Russell. He's a Community of Christ historian that I adore. I think he's awesome. He's a really funny speaker, and I just love, love, love talking to Bill. And I have a lot of Community of Christ friends. And so, and it's funny you just asked this question, because just this past weekend, I was at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, SSSR. And they talked about this very question, so I'm kind of prepared for this. And in the 1970s and 80s, the LDS Church was growing like crazy, and there were these predictions that by, I want to say 2035, we would have like 80 million members. We don't have 80 million members. I mean, it's still a decade away, I guess. Anything can happen, but it doesn't seem like we're on that growth projection. And so the church leaders in the 70s and 80s would use this astronomical growth that we were experiencing at the time as proof that God approves of our message, and therefore we are the true church. And so it was a very common thing for church leaders in general conferences to be like, see, this is God's proof that God is on our side, which is great while the church is growing. But then the internet came and the church is not growing like it was. We're much smaller than the predictions were. And so that message does tend to say, ooh. And so church leaders don't say it anymore. Because if the church is true while we're growing, if we quit growing, what does that say? What's the other message? Well, it must not be true anymore. God's not approving of our message. And so, that's one of those logical fallacies that we probably shouldn't have embraced. So, I mean, it is a stereotype. I think the church is getting away from it. We've kind of learned our lesson. But, here in America, we'll talk about America, we've had at least probably 3 great awakenings, maybe 4, where there's these big steady growth, and then there's some decline, and then there's some growth and some decline. And I do believe that right now we are in one of these decline stages, But that doesn't mean that we're not going to get back on a growth stage. And so we need a larger lens of history. When Joseph Smith became prophet, that was during one of these it was during the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening happened earlier. And so it's too hard to tell. I've asked this question and nobody will give me a straight answer. Was the 50s through the 90s, was that a third Great Awakening? And it's too hard for historians because it's such recent past to tell, but it could be. And so I'd like to call that period the third Great Awakening here in America. And then now we're kind of bottoming out. So I do know a Catholic scholar by the name of Dr. Christina Rossetti that I had on my podcast recently. And, she kind of agreed with that could be what is happening. So it's just hard. Give me another 100 years and we'll be able to say, yes, the 50s through the 80s were the third Great Awakening. we just can't tell that yet. I just remembered one other thing I was going to say about Christina. She said, after the First Great Awakening, the Puritans disappeared. Like they don't exist anymore. And so that could be what happens is some of these churches just no longer exist. And so you never know.
Yeah, you never know. And now that we wrap up the interview, first of all, thank you for accepting to come on. I think it's been an interesting conversation, and I think that it'll really help anyone who will be listening. And the very last question, I was listening to some interviews you've done in the past just to get ready for it. And there's some who have asked you, after talking to Sandra Tanner, after talking to Dan Vogel, after knowing about Mountain Meadows Massacre, Mark Hoffman, how did the prophets didn't recognize that this was a scam right away, right? And things like that. And some people ask, maybe in the surprised way, why do you still believe after all of that, right? So I think my question is not as surprised, but my question would be, why, at the end of the day, after knowing the good, the bad, and the ugly, why do you still remain a Latter-day Saint?
It's a good question, and I don't think I will have an answer that will satisfy everyone. So I'll just start off with that. I look at the Apostle Paul, and he says, and this is the Apostle Paul in the Bible, and he says, we see through a glass darkly. I do know some church leaders like to portray themselves as, quote, seeing around corners. And I think that does a disservice to people who realize that they make mistakes. I asked that question to Kurt Bench, who was a good friend of Mark Hoffman, who actually called Mark Hoffman on the day of the first bombing and said, Mark, you got to be careful. There's a bomber out there. And he just said that, they don't see around corners. They get fooled just like all of us. And when we expect our leaders to be perfect, they will disappoint us. And it's impossible. None of us are perfect. And so if we believe that they're perfect and that they do see around corners, and I know some leaders like to portray that they do, it does a disservice, and it causes people, when they see these mistakes, when they see these Mark Hoffman episodes, to naturally lose faith. And I wish that they would embrace their humanity a little bit more. Mark didn't just fool President Kimball. He fooled the FBI. He fooled the Library of Congress. Like, he was a master forger. And to think that President Kimball has any more scientific knowledge than the Library of Congress and the FBI. I mean, the FBI called some of those forgeries legitimate. It does a disservice to people when they just think, oh, the prophet does no wrong. They make mistakes. And I think we need to, Jesus said, with what judgment you give, you will be given. And so when we judge our leaders too harshly, expect to be judged harsh. So I think we need to be more forgiving of our leaders. They do make mistakes, and we shouldn't expect them to be perfect. And I remember talking to Elder Snow, and I asked him that question: is the church hiding things? The answer was kind of like yes and no. Like, we put it on the website, but we only want certain people to see it, the people who are seeking for it. But we don't want to destroy everybody's faith. And so that's kind of the way I am. If you come across my channel and if it resonates with you, great. And if it doesn't resonate you, go listen to the Tabernacle Choir or something, So